Hello, this is the third video in the Germany series. This is looking at Nazi control and dictatorship. So this is looking at the period from January 1933, when Hitler has become Chancellor, up until 1939, when World War II began. And it's looking at two things. Firstly, how did Hitler become a dictator? And then it's looking at how the Nazis managed to keep control after that. So to be able to answer these questions, really, we need to understand what a dictatorship is. So a dictatorship is when there is a dictator, and a dictator is someone who is above the law. They not only create the laws are passed, they have complete power, and that is what Hitler became by August 1934. So we need to work out why that was the case. So let's have a look. How did Hitler become a dictator? Well, the first thing he did was became the Chancellor in January 1933, and straight away he was looking for opportunities to be able to weaken his political opponents so that he could strengthen his position in the Reichstag and seize more power. And he was lucky, because in February 1933, just 1 month after taking power, there was a fire in the Reichstag. It was started, we think, by a single communist, Marinus van der Lubbe, but the Nazis were able to blame all communists for it. They said that it was a huge conspiracy. They made up a story. People believed it, and it meant that Hitler and the Nazis were able to kick the communists out of the Reichstag and arrest them, and to ban the Communist Party, which meant that within a month of taking power, he's managed to remove the greatest threat to him, because at that time the communists were also doing very well. Now, he doesn't want to just do that. He's looking to become a dictator, to have complete power. So he's weakened his opponents, but he needs to keep going. So what he did was, having succeeded in kicking out the communists, he then pressured Parliament. So he put pressure on Parliament because he wants them to pass a law, and that law would give him huge amounts of power for 4 years. But why would Parliament give that to him? Unless you're a Nazi and from the Nazi Party, why would you want to give Hitler more power? You probably wouldn't. So what he did was he put huge pressure on the other parties to agree with him. He had Nazis in the Reichstag with guns and so on, his members of his SA. And as a result of all of this, Parliament was prepared to pass the Enabling Act. And this Enabling Act allowed Hitler to pass any law he liked for 4 years. And this really was the end of the Weimar Republic, because in a republic you have democracy and laws are passed by Parliament. Now you've got 4 years in which Hitler is able to create any law he wants. That was really the end of the Weimar Republic, and he's done that through pressuring Parliament into accepting his Enabling Act. But then he still wants to become this overall dictator. That's only for 4 years. And so what he does is this. When Hindenburg, the next year in 1934, dies of old age, he decides to call a vote. It's called a plebiscite, or a vote. And in this vote, the people were asked to decide whether they wanted Hitler now to become a Führer. And a Führer is a leader, and it means someone who is both Chancellor and President. So he put this to a popular vote. And in this plebiscite, or vote, the vast majority of people did, because Hitler at that time had significant amounts of popular support, still early on. He's only been the Chancellor for a year, still very popular, took advantage of that to become the Führer. And then, at that point, he has become a dictator. He has complete control over Germany, no longer needs the Enabling Act. He can now come up with whatever law he wants, because he is the overall leader. And at that point, he declares Germany to be a Third Reich, which means that Germany is now the third empire. It's had 2 attempts at being an empire before, and now it's the third one. And this, as we know, is the empire that Hitler hopes will last for 1,000 years. Now, if he wants it to last for 1,000 years, well, he's going to have to work out how to keep control. And the Nazis were experts in keeping control of Germany. So keeping control means that you see threats or dangers that might get in the way of you keeping control, and you tackle those threats. And that's exactly what Hitler did. From 1934, which is the year when he became the dictator, through to 1939 with the start of World War II. And the first thing he did was he used terror. So he saw threats, and his most effective weapon, some would argue, was simply to scare the hell out of anyone who might be a political opponent so that they weren't prepared to do anything against him. And he was extremely brutal in using terror so that his opponents really did understand the consequences that they would face if they were prepared to stand against him. So, firstly, he tackles internal threats. Internal means threats within his own party. External means people outside the Nazi party. So the first thing he did was he tackled the internal threats because he saw that there was a danger from within, or he thought there was, from the SA, from the stormtroopers. The stormtroopers had been very loyal to Hitler. They'd helped him hugely in taking power in 1933, but he was worried that under the leadership of Ernst Röhm, the leader of the SA, that they were becoming too powerful. Hundreds of thousands of people were in the organization. Ernst Röhm and many others in the SA were interested in socialist ideas, which Hitler did not want. He wanted nationalism. And so he thought the best solution to this was simple. He would simply kill off the SA leaders, killed 100 of them, including Ernst Röhm, without asking any questions about whether they really were being disloyal. And as a result, kind of crushed the SA and reduced the risk of there being an internal threat, and there was no real dangers from within after that. He was also, of course, interested in tackling external threats, so threats from within Germany, but not from the Nazi party. And what he did for this was he set up a police state. And the police in a police state are above the law, as are the people in power. And he gave this control of this police state to the SS, his loyal bodyguard, and under the leadership of Heinrich Himmler, the leader of the SS, they created two organizations, the Gestapo, the secret police, and they were responsible for spying on ordinary people. They had huge numbers of informants, and as a result of that, people became incredibly scared to talk out in any way about Hitler, even to make jokes about him, because they knew that they would suffer potentially huge consequences, and so people just self-censored. They didn't say anything negative about the Nazis for fear of what would happen next. Political opponents, potentially socialists or communists that were still around, they were monitored very closely by another organization that was part of the police state called the SD, the security force, and they were spied upon, and as a result, it was very difficult for there to be any kind of meaningful opposition to threaten the Nazis because they were just so successful at crushing it. And part of that external threat, or tackling that external threat, was the creation of concentration camps. So it's not enough to just have a police force that finds people who might be a threat. You also need to create some sort of concentration camp or prison so that people are aware of the consequences of going against Hitler. These concentration camps were old factories, or they were just buildings that had been abandoned, and they were turned into these huge prison centres with 150,000 people being incarcerated, which means imprisoned, by 1939. Huge numbers of people put in there because they were seen as a danger to the Nazis. The second way that Hitler managed to keep control was by taking more control over people's faith, because Germany, obviously a Christian country, lots of things that the Nazis were doing were against the Bible, against the Ten Commandments, and so understandably, if you are a good Christian, you might have doubts about Hitler and what he's doing. So he decided the best way to tackle that was to take greater control over the way that people would be thinking about their faith. First thing he did was he tackled the problem of the Catholics in Germany, huge numbers of Catholics. What he did was he signed a Concordat in 1933, which is an agreement with the Pope. And this agreement was that Hitler would allow the churches to continue and the Catholic youth clubs and so on to keep going, as long as the church did not interfere in any way or say anything negative about the Nazis. The Pope, guy on the right, agreed shamefully with this, which meant that the Catholic Church failed to speak out even as the Nazis were carrying out these terrible atrocities, and they did that in return for the continuing faith or continuing of the Catholic Church in Germany. The Protestant Church, Hitler took more control of, not of all the churches, but he created his own church called the Reich Church. Reich means empire, as we know, so he created a kind of a Nazi empire church, and this, as you can see from the swastika on the altar, this was all about connecting Christianity with Nazi views. So they cherry-picked, which means picked the best bits for them of the Bible, and they just used those to show that actually they were doing best not just for Germany but for the world. Finally, the Nazis kept control by using propaganda, which means, of course, influencing the way people think. Good words here would be brainwashing, or even better, indoctrinating. So indoctrinating people, so to change the very way that they think, so that they became convinced that the Nazis were the best solution to Germany's problems. And the man who masterminded that was called Goebbels, Joseph Goebbels, picture of him there. He was the Minister of Enlightenment and Propaganda, and his job was to convince Germans that the Nazis were the best solution for Germany's problems. And he did that by creating simple messages. These messages were shared. This message was essentially that Hitler is your father, Hitler will save Germany, and that our enemies are the Jews. If we can stop people being if we can crush our enemies, then Germany will be strong. It couldn't be more simple. And he presented that message through a number of different media. Firstly, through posters. The poster on this slide shows Hitler as a saviour. This would have gone up all over Germany and would have convinced some people that Hitler really was the saviour, the strong man to help them. It was also put on radio. Radios were created or manufactured at a cheap price, which meant that lots of families could afford them, 70%, and then Hitler would use this as a way of getting out his messaging. And they also controlled the press as well, which meant the newspapers were also publishing positive things about the Nazis. Now, that probably wouldn't have been enough to really indoctrinate people, because it's just a message. You need to convince people that the message is accurate, and so they need to bring the message to life. And they did this through creating huge events that really convinced people that the Nazis and Germany really were the best country in the world. You're hearing a lot at the moment with Britain, which is kind of interesting, parallel. Our government is constantly talking about us being the world's best at this, that, and the other. That's similar to the kind of approach that the Nazis took, which was to say that we are the world's best. And they showed it, for example, by creating rallies, huge rallies like the 1934 Nuremberg rally. 200,000 people turned up, light shows, music shows, Hitler speaking. It was really like a religious event, similar to these huge events that you have in faith where groups of people come together. It would have felt a little like that to the people that were there. Then on the right, you've got the Olympics. The Nazis were lucky. They got to host the Olympics in 1936 in Berlin. This was a chance to showcase their incredible architecture, which was impressive, modern architecture. And also they spent huge amounts of money training up their athletes, and they won the most medals, which of course convinced many Germans that they really were a special race of people. The Aryan race was something the Nazis called them. And of course more and more people believed it. And another reason why people believed the things the Nazis were saying is that there were no alternative voices because of censorship. The Nazis banned newspapers that weren't saying positive things about the Nazis. So it's very difficult for me, if I'm someone who's maybe a bit skeptical about the Nazis, to hear alternative views. I can't hear them because the Nazis are crushing any kind of opposition. So there's no alternative newspaper views. And also people began, encouraged by the Nazis, to just self-censor, to think, well, actually, I don't want to come across anything that goes against what the Nazis say. And so people even began to burn books. They'd burn books written by Jewish people or socialists or communists because they wanted to be seen as pure Nazis. And as a result of all this, the censorship and also the other forms of propaganda, combined also with the control they had over the church, and finally the control they had through terror, the Nazis were able to keep control up until World War II, 1939. There you go.